Thank you for the introduction, and it's really a great pleasure to be here and a great honor to represent somehow Estonia, maybe not Estonian aesthetics, but at least the institution the conference is taking place right now. And the title of my presentation is Aesthetics and Semiotics, partly site-specific. And to start with, I should explain a little my choice of the subject for today's presentation. My first reason is that in aesthetics and art theoretical discussions, people often place the semiotic analysis in the opposition to some more immediate or direct method of analysis. The semiotic analysis is in this case understood as something which is mediated by language and believed rather to wrap around the works. The semiotic approach is a part of meta level. It is a distance interpretation, or as a semiotician Wilfred Neuf put it, quotation, semiotic approaches to aesthetic consider works of art as signs and texts whose production and reception are a specific process of semiosis. End of quotation. An immediate experience, sensation, imagination, and intuition are placed into different, hence a kind of non-semiotic sphere. Such differentiation can particularly be seen in phenomenological aesthetics, but elsewhere as well. Therefore, I'm interested in how the semioticity is understood in these cases and whether such a cautiously distant attitude is mutual. The second motivation of my presentation is, of course, to link this relationship to a local perspective. In order to examine the interrelationship between aesthetics and semiotics, a certain delineation should be first be made between the two disciplines, and at least some common ground should be established. I shall first of all rely on those authors who have explicitly addressed both disciplines. A possible common ground could be the phenomenon of art, but also other issues of interest to aesthetics, such as aesthetic experience, communication, or value. Such inquiry could in principle be traced back to Baumgarten's Aesthetica. Alexander Baumgarten, as is well known, aspired to establish aesthetics as a science of sensors or perceptual cognition, in order to grant the human senses a worthy place beside logical, rational cognition. In the introduction, prolegomena, to the first volume of his Aesthetica, Baumgarten also mentioned semiotics as a branch of theoretical aesthetics concerned with the science of what are beautifully thought out and arranged. His magnum opus was to consist of two major parts, theoretical and practical aesthetics. Of the three main chapters of his theoretical aesthetics, heuristic, methodology, and semiotics, Baumgarten more or less managed to complete only the first. These three chapters follow the tripartite division of rhetoric used since antiquity. Inventia means heuristic, dispositio, that's methodology, and elocutia. The latter was thus Baumgarten's equivalent to semiotics. The chapter Semiotics could have examined one of the sources of aesthetic pleasure, quotation, the harmony or the coherence of the signs among themselves and with the order and the things, as far as it appears. It means the beauty of the expression, for example, the formulation and the style, elocutia. The meaning of the term semiotics in the 18th century was still relatively open. The term could be filled in different meanings, although it held an inevitable etymological connection to the ideas of sign and signifying. If Baumgarten had the possibility to finish his work and convincingly lay out the role of semiotics, it is difficult to say whether this would have somehow changed the course of the later development of semiotics as a discipline or not. Charles Sanders Peirce, one of the founding fathers of semiotics, or a pioneer or backwoodsman, as he once called himself, sought also in his passion to systematization to find place for aesthetics. This is primarily in his 1903 Harvard lectures on pragmatics and other texts from the same period. We could say that Peirce's perspective is in some sense opposite to that of Baumgarten's. Baumgarten tried out the potential of still vague word semiotics in his system of theoretical aesthetics. Likewise, aesthetics was for Peirce something vague. He admitted on several occasions that, quotation, "I'm not well acquainted with this science," or aesthetics, if I am to take the word of others that there is such a science, I myself being lamentably ignorant of it, as I fear will too plainly appear. Still, Peirce concedes that he had in his youth eagerly read Schiller's Ästhetische Briefe. Additionally, Peirce states that he is increasingly convinced that semiotics, which in his system corresponded to logic, requires support from aesthetics. This line of thinking brings Peirce closer to Baumgarten, who tried to establish the science of sensuous cognition as a parallel to Wolffian's science of rational cognition. Notwithstanding Peirce's admitted ignorance of aesthetics, it is important to examine how he understood it. He did not deem it a mere study of beauty, senses, perception, or feelings. Peirce, who preferred to rely on tripartite divisions, distinguished in his classification of sciences first mathematics, philosophy, and special science. Philosophy was in turn divided into phenomenology, which dealt with fundamental categories and had the task of analyzing and organizing all human experiences, normative sciences, and metaphysics. Mathematics established the foundation for phenomenology, which in turn, together with mathematics, formed normative sciences and so on. Peirce borrowed the general idea of his hierarchy of sciences from Auguste Comte, although its structure ended up being different, including humanities while excluding social sciences, which were very important for Comte. Indeed, Peirce left aside all social aspects in his attempt to systemize truth and related categories. The aim of the normative sciences was to investigate what ought to be and distinguish it what ought not to be. These sciences are thus firmly purposive, aiming to investigate the nature of the summum bonum, the highest or ultimate good. Peirce treats the summum bonum as a self-explanatory and self-contained concept. It is precisely the normative sciences that included aesthetics as well as ethics and logic, that are, according to Peirce, the doctrines of the beautiful, the good, and the true. At the same time, these ends are interrelated, so the common goal of the normative sciences is to distinguish good and evil in different but still coherent ways. Truth as an end ought to be good, goodness pleasant and admirable. So a kind of Platonic allogogatia, that is the relationship between positive qualities, can be sensed in these thoughts. At the same time, Peirce considers that aesthetics, quotation, is the science of ideals, or of that which is objectively admirable without any ulterior reasons, and further, that science has been handicapped by the definition of it as the theory of beauty. The conception of beauty is but the product of this science, and a very inadequate attempt is to grasp what it is that aesthetic seeks to make clear. So he admitted that aesthetic is an important discipline and integral part of his system, but it was not clear what the object of this discipline is, actually. And it's also the voice of a logicians you can hear here. The logic was the Peirce's main discipline. Or the ends of aesthetics would need to be purified from the efforts of what we would like to experience, like receiving pleasure. Instead of beauty as its goal, an appropriate term would be have yet found us. We have not in our language a word of requisite generalities at Peirce. And for want of a better one, he uses the bracketed Greek word kalos. In stressing the inevitable purposelessness of his aesthetics, Peirce gives it a significantly renewed meaning. Still, his reflections on aesthetics were rather fragmentary, and so he missed the promising possible connection between aesthetic experience and the category of firstness. Firstness is one of the three universal categories of Peirce's theory, along with the secondness and thirdness. It is something, quotation, which is what it is, without reference to anything else, or a pure quality, an immediate feeling. It is precisely the category of firstness that could help semiotics to overcome its typical distance from immediate experience, sensory perception, and effects. Later, for instance, Mike Ball and Norman Bryson attempted to ally Peirce's positions with art theory in their essay Semiotics and Art History from 1991. They believed that among the classics of semiotics, Peirce's dynamic theory of semiosis and several of his main concepts can be of great benefit in analyzing, for example, why some elements of image can be seductive or deceptive. Following the thread of connecting aesthetics and semiotics, one should also mention the works of Charles Morris and the Prague Linguistic Circle in the 1930s. In my talk today, they will unfortunately have to remain in the marginalia, or both for primarily interested in what makes an object an artwork, thus introducing to the concept of art an aspect of relativism. Morris continued the American pragmatist semiotics, and in his rather simplistic behaviorist approach, Morris characterized art as mimetic sign of value. Quotation, the aesthetic sign is an iconic sign whose designatum is a value, and which in turn is connected to the interest in this sign. The works of Prague Linguistic Circle would be more pertinent here, especially the theory of functional aesthetics developed by Jan Mukarzowski, which due to World War II and the ensuing Stalinist pressure campaign remained for decades unknown in the rest of the world. Mukarzowski analyzed the autonomous aesthetic function of the work of art, distinguishing it from others, including the communicative function. This may act together, but it is only the first that underlines the special character of an artwork. The aesthetic function can be carried by any object or phenomenon. This is not something fixed in time, and thus the borders between art and non-art prove to be dynamic. Mukarzowski also discussed the questions of aesthetic value, norm, and canon, but connected them to social and institutional processes. The work of several more recent authors would deserve to be mentioned, including Umberto Eco's semiotics that have been largely related to aesthetics and so on. I will, however, now move decisively to the second impetus of my presentation, the local perspective. In order to consider the common ground between aesthetics and semiotics from local viewpoint, two concessions need to be made. Firstly, we have to start with the period after the Second World War, because it's not possible to talk about semiotics before that. Secondly, the framework has to be broadened beyond Estonia, since both semiotics and aesthetics developed primarily in the Russian-speaking cultural sphere. As a discipline, aesthetics is studied and taught almost all over the world. In academia, scholars of aesthetics can mostly be found in the departments of philosophy and arts. Semiotics, by contrast, have found a place in the programs of only a small number of universities. Estonia is one of these few places where semiotics is taught at all three levels of study. About 20 researchers and lecturs, plus several doctoral students, work at the Department of Semiotics at the University of Tartu. Such a high concentration of semioticians can hardly be found in any other universities of the world. We can say that scholars of aesthetics are more evenly scattered over the world, but semioticians are concentrated in a smaller number of places, and Estonia just happens to be one of such centers. It should also be noted that this year Estonia celebrated the 100th anniversary of Juri Lotman, the founder and center figure of the local school of semiotics. And the Soviet Union and aesthetics. One of the few Estonian scholars of aesthetics during the Soviet period, Leonid Stolovich, wrote in his memoirs that no books on aesthetics were published in the Soviet Union during the whole Stalinist period. However, after the Second World War, aesthetics was a mandatory subject in the curricula of art and music academies, which were standardized all over the Soviet Union. The subject on aesthetics was also taught as an optional course to the students of humanities. We still have to bear in mind that the official name of the course of aesthetics included the letters M and L, meaning Marxist-Leninist, indicating that aesthetics was a part of the so-called red subjects. The curriculum which all university students had to pass in the Soviet Union were firmly based on such iron reinforcement as the history of Communist Party, dialectical and historical materialism, political economy, and scientific communism. At different times and different universities, the curricula could vary to a certain extent to include atheism, aesthetics, history, philosophy, and Soviet law. But even these curricula were determined by high-ups in ideological centers, and the schools had no say about them. Teaching of red subjects found its form in the 1930s. It was largely based on the structure of Stalin's history of the All-Union Communist Bolshevik Party, a short course. But the final list of red subjects was specified and established during the Khrushchev thaw as a result of the same Communist Party Congress in 1956, where the Stalin's personality cult was revealed. After the Khrushchev's reform, the chairs of philosophy were enlarged everywhere. Thereby, atheism and communism were scientific, and philosophy, ethics, and aesthetics were Marxist-Leninist. Aesthetics was an integral part of the Marxist-Leninist philosophy, but at the same time, still somehow ambiguous area. Firstly, the classics of Marxism and Leninism, meaning Marx, Engels, and Lenin, did not provide the readers with any substantial discussions on aesthetics. Soviet aesthetics seemingly existed, but it lacked the real Marxist core, the real center which could support discussions and studies. Secondly, the ambiguity of aesthetics was also caused by its inclusion in the curricula of all creative specialities after the Second World War, and by the need to provide artists, musicians, and writers all over the Soviet Union with right positions. We can conclude that although there was the obligation to teach the subject based on uniform basic principles, there were no theoretical core, no literature, or even people who could implement this task. There were maybe only a dozen people trained as aestheticians in the Stalinist period. Students could study aesthetics when majoring in philosophy, like Leonid Stolovich had done. Universities were obliged to teach, but they lacked the necessary resources. Instead of textbook, every year universities received a typewritten course summary in Russian, including the compulsory topics and the right perspective to the subject. Teaching aesthetics in Estonia proved to be a helpful task for several young Jewish intellectuals who had come here to escape political pressure in Leningrad and other Russian centers, such as Leonid Stolovich, Boris Bernstein, also Yuri Lotman, and so on. However, even tragicomic situation could happen with quite random people who tried to teach. It would be quite an interesting intellectual game to speculate on what was really going on at these lectures. It is clear that quite varied and complex but unlinkable singular constructions were formulated at Soviet universities under the term Marxist-Leninist aesthetics in early 50s. Stolovich was also right in stating that aesthetics of the Stalinist period actually was not a part of philosophy. Primarily, it was a bricolage-like art theory in ideological source, which was with random deviations created and recreated around some predetermined keywords. This kind of singularity persisted also afterwards, it means in 1960s, 70s, and 80s. For example, at our art academy, throughout the Soviet era, aesthetics was taught by colorful and interesting art historians who gave it an enjoyable and personal approach. And the main characters here is again Boris Bernstein, Leo Soompää, Estonian art historian, Kaia Lehari, who somebody will maybe know or remember her, and Jaak Angilaski. Aesthetics as a discipline started to develop only after Stalin's death. Translations as well as new original treatments were published, and certain different Soviet schools of aesthetics emerged. Some authors have later described the period from the Khrushchev's storm until the late 1970s as the golden time of the Soviet aesthetics. And, well, yes, just a list of main publications published in Estonian. It is not very long, but well, there were some materials also translated, and also some which were originally written in Estonian. The 1960s and 1970s can also be considered the golden time of Soviet semiotics. Aesthetics was recognized as an independent discipline all through the Soviet period, but the development of semiotics has been, if you can say so, much more dramatic. First, its background involved the Russian formal school in the 1920s, which had been mercilessly suppressed in the early 1930s. After Stalin's death, a new interest arose in structural linguistics, which in the Soviet Union was tightly interwoven with the development of information theory and cybernetics. Particularly in the 1960s, the impact of cybernetics and information theory transcended their disciplinary boundaries, leaving a distinguishable mark on the humanities, including aesthetics. This process was characterized by the borrowing of concepts and their metaphorization and hybridization. Such interaction was not unique to the Soviet Union, as cybernetics and structuralism played an influential role on both sides of the Iron Curtain. But I would argue that in the Soviet Union, this tendency was most prevalent and popular as one of the convenient ways of retreating from Marxism-Leninism. The proliferation of information theoretical and cybernetic vocabularies characterized the growth of scientific ambitions in Soviet humanities, resonating with the official discourse of scientific and technological revolution. It should be noted, however, that while these fields have played a certain role in the development of Soviet military science, in the humanities they played a much more liberating role. At the end of the 1950s, the emerging new field of semiotics in Moscow also attempted to take part in the scientific revolution of the Soviet humanities. The first backlash to the development of semiotics occurred at the end of the 1958. On the 23rd of October, Boris Pasternak was given the Nobel Prize in Literature, but the Soviets forced him to give it up. He had published his novel, Dr. Zhivago, in Italy after it has been rejected by Soviet publishers. This act was officially treated as giving the enemies of the Soviet Union the opportunity to undermine the Soviet regime by giving Pasternak the prize. This was followed by the mandatory campaign of public denunciation over the Soviet Union, often under the slogan, "I did not read it, but I condemn." Я не читал, но осуждаю. Vyacheslav Ivanov, the leader of Moscow Semioticians, refused to condemn Pasternak and was fired from his position at the Moscow State University. Pasternak had earlier been connected with the members of the Russian formal school, and this was the reason why the holder of the school's continuity, Roman Jakobson, was condemned as well. Jakobson, who had emigrated from the Soviet Union in 1920, started to renew his professional relations with colleagues in the Soviet Union in 1956. He has had a considerable effect on the development of Soviet semiotics. But after this incident, he was again for several years called the traitor of his homeland. However, the development of cybernetics proved to be so powerful and the need for it so vital that in 1959, the Scientific Council of Cybernetics was established at the Academy of Sciences of the Soviet Union under the leadership of Axel Berg. Its objective was primarily to turn cybernetics into a kind of meta-science or an umbrella science. As a result, the section of structural linguistics and semiotics was also formed under it, which helped to rehabilitate and promote their study. The next backlash arrived at the end of 1962. Structuralism's quest for comprehensiveness inevitably led to, at some point, an interest in wider cultural sphere. Literature and folklore, as linguistic phenomena, formed suitable research objects. But younger structuralists became increasingly more interested in non-linguistic science systems. This development could be considered a decisive moment in the forming of cultural semiotics in the Soviet Union. One of the important landmarks was the joint symposium of the Moscow Institute of Slavistics and the Cybernetic Council of the Academy of Sciences, held on the 19th to 25th of December 1962. The symposium on the structural study of science systems became known as the Semiotics Symposium. Its participants discussed the problems concerning advertising, film, music, and visual arts, and cast also a semiotic glance upon abstractionism. The voluminous booklet of abstracts of the symposium was sent to be typeset on the 25th of October and to print on the 28th of November. But between the printing of the book and the symposium, the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, visited an exhibition opened in the Moscow Manege exhibition hall and became personally convinced in the anti-Soviet character of abstract art. This event has been much discussed in relation to the development of art and politics in the Soviet Union, hence there is no need to talk here about its history and aftermaths. The following campaign of re-educating writers and artists, which primarily targeted their increasing interest in modernism, is also quite well known. Abstractionism became one of the key terms of this campaign, but its wide objective was to keep in check all kinds of modernist developments, such as experimenting with free verse, the decaphonic music, and so on. Hence, by the end of 1962, it became clear that as soon as semiotics began to take an interest in wider cultural phenomena, it became suspicious in the eyes of the authorities. Paradoxically, one of the results of the Khrushchev campaign was the appearance of the Tartu-Moscow School of Cultural Semiotics. This meant the broadening of the area under study as well as the expansion of the geographical area of the so far Moscow-centered movement. In the late 1950s, the scholars of Russian literature of the Tartu State University, led by Yuri Lotman, started also take interest in structuralism. The Tartu philologists, with the support of rector Fyodor Clement, offered the Muscovites possibilities to continue their activities sheltered in the periphery. Since 1964, 4 summer schools were held at the University of Tartu sports facility in Käriku, South Estonia, and the serious science system studies through the Bosnako system was launched. Hence, we cannot talk about the established school before the year 1964. Most of its members, especially those from Moscow, had a background in linguistics, and to less extent also in folkloristics. The members from Tartu were mostly literary scholars. The starting ground of the school was heterogeneous, drawing together Russian formalism and the Prague Linguistic Circle, structural linguistics, including the Linguistic Circle of Copenhagen, cybernetics, information theory, and mathematical linguistics. However, the theoretical background of Tartu Moscow School was largely linked to the Sassurian tradition and continental European semiotics. Percy's writings were known, but more superficially. Occasionally, his classification of science into iconic, indexical, and symbolic science was applied. After 1962, the public use of the term semiotics was avoided up to the end of the decade. We can conclude that the authorities perceived a danger mostly in the semiotic study of arts, not in the structural linguistics. Starting from the late 1960s, abstract art was at least in the outlying areas of the Soviet Union, meaning Estonia and other Baltic states, little by little regaining its place in exhibition halls. But characteristically, even here, people avoided mentioning the term, and there was no public discussions about abstractionism. Pressure from the powers that be continued, however, and this is one of the reasons for the Tartu Moscow School decline in the late 1970s. Several members emigrated and others were subjected to tighter controls, including being restricted on traveling abroad. The school thus dispersed into the activities of individual members such as Yuri Lotman and Zara Mintz, Boris Uspensky, Vyacheslav Ivanov, and others. However, because their works were published in academic journals in small print runs, they remained out of the wider limelight, and at the same time they were also translated into English, but also published in a very, very small print run, so known only in narrow academic circles. To return to the common ground shared by aesthetics and semiotics, we find here both discords but also evident common features. As mentioned earlier, aesthetics was an ideological discipline in the Soviet Union. In 1964, Nikolai Goncharenko published in the British Journal of Aesthetics an overview of the Soviet aesthetics. I quote, "Sometimes I am asked what different movements in aesthetics exist in my country. Movements which have different ideological coloring do not exist because we are all followers of one ideology, Marxist-Leninist. However, consequent unity of theoretical principles is no obstacle to disputes and discussions or expressions of different points of view. And that is really rather accurate characterization of the state of affairs of the time. Mikhail Lifshitz, a Marxist philosopher with a controversial background, tried to create a certain coherent system of Marxist art philosophy by publishing compilations of citations by Marxist-Leninist classics. This endeavor, however, was not quite convincing both to the ideological apparatus and was of little use to the wider readership. The aesthetic gap left by Marxist-Leninist classics permitted it to be more freely filled with multifaceted content than it would have been possible in other disciplines. The discussions were, for instance, concerned with the essence of the aesthetic, Does it come about naturally, or is it socially determined? Is it objective, or to some extent also individual and subjective? The discussions inevitably also touched upon the questions of realism and the relationship between arts and social classes. Ideologically freer and more original were the treatments of aesthetic categories, including the comic and the tragic. In addition to all this, the Soviet aesthetics was characterized by a remarkably wide breadth. It was concerned with everything between the aesthetic education of the people, so-called broad masses of the workers, and the aesthetic analysis of actually non-existent consumables and the poorly constructed urban living environment. So it has a kind of utopian dimension too. Dealing with these issues was already prescribed in the program of the Communist Party adopted in 1961. Given that for some inexplicable reason the word design was not allowed to be used in the Soviet Union, its domain of concern was also being considered under the term technical aesthetics. It was characteristic that the debates on design, production, and the environment were considerably freer than the philosophical core of aesthetics. In this context, it was possible to put forward some rather bold ideas. In contrast, the ideas about relativism were suspicious. The problems of the individuals in the immediate experience were left aside, nor were the concept of value or studies in axiology fully accepted by the authorities. Perhaps the most promising and distinctive current, however, developed from the confluence of information theory, structuralism, and semiotics. First and foremost, this found expression in discussions about art as communication, but also regarding the structure of an artwork, and it was also, these topics were also studied by the aestheticians themselves, not only by the semioticians. We can thus say that during the golden time of Soviet semiotics and aesthetics, their interest and influence were mutual. Cultural semiotics addressed primarily literature, to a lesser extent film and past periods in art. One can here think of Boris Uspensky's works. After 1962, Tartu Moscow school members avoided speaking out of modernism and avant-garde art and literature. On this shared ground, aesthetics covered a wider range of concerns while being bridled by a significantly strict ideological control. Aesthetics also needed to persistently justify the utility of the sphere of art. This made aesthetics almost akin to the normative sciences formulated by Charles Sanders Peirce. Of course, even semioticians published from time to time articles in the daily press about the grandiose future possibilities of semiotics, which were clearly motivated by the need for self-justification. That said, the writings of semioticians managed to be remarkably free of ideological influences, containing no single reference to the classic of Marxism-Leninism or Communist Party guidelines, all of which the aestheticians could not afford to avoid. In terms of the significant common ground that emerged between the two disciplines at their height, this was made possible by two things. Structural semiotics evolved towards cultural semiotics and began to take a lively interest in the sphere of art, including the problems of representation and communication. Aesthetics, on the other hand, received impulses from the same soil from which the early variant of the Soviet semiotics grew, structuralism and cybernetics. This commonality supported at the very point I made at the beginning of my presentation, that the semiotic approach to art is something mediated, branching out at a certain distance meta level and excluding an immediate experience and perception. Or, semiotic approaches to aesthetics consider works of art as signs and texts. However, a certain detached approach also characterized the aesthetics of that same period, which also tried to find general laws rather than dealing with individual particularities. It should also be stressed that although aestheticians refer to semiotic approaches and semioticians draw on aesthetics, no programmatic text stating a common or combined approach were published. This also implies that the essential disciplinary differences persisted. There was also a different, smaller commonality that emerged around mathematical methods and cybernetics. This too was well known in both sides of the Iron Curtain. For example, the works of Max Bense and Abraham Moll, the latter translation appeared in Russian as early as 1966. In the Soviet Union, for example, the mathematical laws of beauty were being studied and some kind of beauty engineered by machines, and the Tartu-Moscow semioticians were also interested in this direction. These problems were popular in design theory, and cyberneticists and physicists were active participants. In the end of 1970s and early 1980s, even a series of books were dedicated to the subjects, and authors in this series here are some semioticians, but also physicists, cybernetics, and mathematicists who are very much interested in this connection of cybernetics and art and machine and creativity and so on. Together with the cyberneticists in Leningrad, Yuri Lotman tried to develop a new line of research called artonics. That name was inspired by bionics, and it was based on the idea that work of art harbored a kind of miraculous information storage and transmission capacity that could be studied using cybernetic methods. However, this fascination faded by the early 1980s. To conclude and summarize, with this long historical arc, I tried to show, first of all, that the first attempts to link aesthetics and semiotics were motivated by a desire to systemize scientific disciplines. And second, the most promising and organic attempt to link semiotics and aesthetics, in my opinion, was made by Jan Mukozhovsky in the 1930s. However, in my talk it remained very superficial. However, it did not cover all the possibilities of aesthetics, but was primarily concerned with what art is and how it functions. And third, Soviet semiotics and aesthetics were linked by partly overlapping object of study, mutual interest, and similar hybrid influences. This was underpinned by a desire characteristic to the area to borrow scientific methodologies, a shared interest in structuralism, information theory, and cybernetics. The dissolution of the Soviet Union completely redrew the previous picture. Having lost his status as an official ideological science, aesthetics found itself in these new conditions somewhat homeless. While it was freed from ideological pressure, it also lost previous state support. In Estonia, the situation actually did not change that much. We had and have now only a few scholars of aesthetics, but no research groups, centers, or schools. It is precisely for this reason that we are particularly pleased to host this conference in the hope that the topics discussed here might also inspire our researchers and students. Semiotics took advantage of the void left by Marxist-Leninism much more successfully, especially in Estonia. This was facilitated by the general change in the humanities and arts. whereas the late Soviet period was characterized by the desire to retreat from dominant ideology and even a certain aversion to theory, the abolition of censorship and the opening of frontiers led to a proliferation of new theoretical impulses. For the most part, these were received through fluid concepts, random text and introductions without giving them much further consideration. These tendencies were typical to all Eastern European post-communist countries. One specificity of Estonia in the wider Eastern European context was an extensive influence of cultural semiotics. As a hypothesis, it can also assume that this semiotic explosion filled, at least temporarily, a significant part of the theoretical void left by Marxism-Leninism. At the same time, the fascinating interplay between semiotics and aesthetics, characteristic of the 1960s and 1970s, had also quietly faded. Thank you.